Well, this is the third segment, and we're going to be talking about applications of economics of marriage that are related to law. The field of law and economics is a growing field, and it's usually applications that have to do with business. There are increasingly programs like that, many of them in law schools. And when it comes to marriage, what we're looking at is how various laws regarding marriage have an impact on behavior. And we also look at the determinants of various laws about marriage and divorce. One of the applications is looking from a marriage market perspective how various laws are going to affect demand and supply. So one of the first applications that I engaged in was, and following Gary Becker, is in the economic analysis of polygamy. So consider a marriage market defined as a market for the household labor, marital household labor, and within the context of polygamy, most of the countries that have polygamy, that had polygamy, principally relied on women to do the marital household labor. So this is HF using the terminology of my model. And over here we have the quasi-wage for marital household labor. Does anybody need a refresher on these topics? So remember? Okay. That's the quasi-wage. It's not exactly a wage, but it's similar to a wage. And there is a demand by the men who are willing to pay for this kind of work, and a supply by the women who are willing to work in this kind of work. And if the market is free and the demand and supply are allowed to meet in equilibrium, we would have a level Y tag and aggregate level of employment HF. Now what happens if a country imposes monogamy and says, people can only marry in one-to-one matches? And let's say that prior to that, the only exceptions were really called polygyny, where men are allowed to have more than one wife, but women can only have one husband. So the imposition of polygamy, of monogamy, comparing it to a situation of polygamy, really affects the demand for marital household labor. So basically, we're going to have a situation, for example, where monogamy truncates the demand, because the original demand includes men coming back for a second, third, etc. wife. And if that is not allowed, the demand will be lower. So if it's a free market and the forces of demand and supply are allowed to operate, the implication is, thank you, that in a polygamous society, the quasi-wage would be higher. This is under polygamy. The quasi-wage would be higher than in a society that imposes monogamy. Now, that kind of runs against our intuitive knowledge about the countries that have polygamy. It doesn't appear to us that women get more generous, marriage contracts in polygamous societies. Because part of what is going on, if we compare the actual countries who are today polygamous to the ones that are monogamous. So part of what happens when we compare those two kinds of societies is we don't really see that much free market going on, especially in polygamous societies where men and women are not so free to marry who they want and not so free to exit when they want to. So remember, for competition to work, for the demand and supply model to apply, whether it's in the context of industry or in the context of marriage and family, we need to be as close as possible to the assumptions of free markets, which includes freedom to exit and enter, and freedom to enter contracts on your own. In polygamous society, typically, parents are in charge, and more specifically, fathers are in charge of their daughter's marriage. And even young men are not that free to engage in all the marriages they want to. Divorce could sometimes also be limited. So therefore, what we observe in most, I think, polygamous societies today is that they also are typically characterized by control over women by their male relatives. And what we observe is that it's actually possible that this quasi-wage is higher in polygamous society. But the way this would be expressed is through the institution of bride price. Which is a payment that men make to the family of women. So many, if not most, polygamous societies have a bride price. Men have to pay to get married. And in fact, in a publication that appeared, it was an article in the American Economic Review, Papers and Proceedings, I believe it's 1978, I show a correlation between the institution of polygamy and the institution of bride price. And I base myself on anthropological research. So the two institutions are correlated, and this very well can indicate the high quasi-wage of women. But the women themselves, don't actually enjoy their high quasi-wage. Their relatives can capture some of the surplus in that way. Let me go by the presentation now that the computer is on. So far we used marriage in a broad sense of either marriage or cohabitation. Today, one of the subjects we will address is the difference between marriage and cohabitation, because we're paying attention to the institutional framework. I'm also going to talk about the choice between marriage or cohabitation versus non-couple. That's another institutional comparison. I will be very brief and say a few words about a four-way presentation, a four-way choice between marriage, cohabitation, visitation, and no co-parenting at all. Another thing that can be addressed with the law and economics of marriage approach is what is the optimum level of government intervention. For example, do we need government intervention at all? I mean, I studied at the University of Chicago. You know, this very libertarian approach has been promoted there. So from a libertarian point of view, do we really need the government in the business of approving marriages? Is this the role of the government? To the extent that the government is involved, do we want statutory laws of the kind you have in continental Europe, where the government states this is the law, and unless you go through some particular marriage contract, the default will state that this and this is what will happen, for example, in case of divorce. That's statutory law. You also have the common law that's common in that's found in the Anglo-Saxon countries, which don't work so much by statutes, but by how the judges determine various cases. And these are all questions that are very relevant from the perspective of law and economics of marriage. I would also like to, I won't really touch much on it, but there is a connection between the law and economics of marriage and the religion and economics of marriage, because institutions that also regulate marriage in every single society are religious institutions. And of course, the government and the religious authorities often have worked together on these issues. Let's start with the concept of marriage contract. There's a lot of compatibility and possible cross-fertilization between the study of contracts by lawyers and economic analysis of labor markets and marriage markets, even though many transactions between workers and employers or spouses don't involve an actual explicit contract. There is very often an implicit contract between people. And the same is also true between buyers and sellers for products. So to some degree, everything that's been said in contract law also has some applicability to the subject of marriage. So I already said a few words about the economics of polygamy. We're going back to the equilibrium condition. This quasi-wage over here is going to continue to be a theme of today's presentation, as well as I just showed in that brief analysis on the effect of polygamy on quasi-wage. Another example of laws that might affect the quasi-wage, example number 2, is how easy is it to divorce? That will also have an effect on the quasi-wage, and more specifically, is unilateral divorce easy to obtain? Can somebody just walk out of a marriage without having to report to the authorities or prove some wrongdoing or any of those things that were the norm before the introduction of no-fault divorce? So I don't know exactly what laws you have about divorce in Germany, so I'm going to be using examples from the United States. Around 1970, I think exactly 1970, California introduced no-fault divorce, which meant not only that it was possible to divorce without proving that your spouse is at fault, but it was also unilateral divorce. You didn't have to wait. You could just say, I want to divorce and get out. What is the effect of that from a perspective of demand and supply of marriage in terms of my model? Well, as I have shown in an article that appeared in this volume called The New Economics of Human Behavior, Cambridge University Press, there I had an analysis that looks a little bit like this. If you have supply and demand, and women's work in marital production, over here you have the quasi-wage. One way of interpreting the unilateral divorce from the perspective of women who would want to specialize in marital production, and they see it as a career, and they are expecting a certain quasi-wage in terms of a lifetime commitment. So this is just, let's say, one period in the horizon. And if you assume that there's going to be a flow of this quasi-wage going on over a lifetime, then no-fault divorce creates the possibility that at one sudden point, the payments will stop. It's, if you look at the equivalent in the workplace, it's no protection against unemployment. Your employer can suddenly fire you and stop paying you. So what that amounts to in terms of permanent income, it's a reduction in permanent income. It's the reduction in the security of your employment is a reduction in benefits. So you can look at the previous divorce laws as a way of boosting the quasi-wage. The government was boosting the quasi-wage for women, the women being the ones who are more likely to be the workers. Okay, and the introduction of no-fault divorce drops this kind of minimum wage. So before, this would be the market wage. Prior to the change in law, the government had kind of imposed some minimum wage by incorporating forced benefits that men had to pay because they were obliged to stay in marriages when they didn't want to. And then you take this away and you get closer to the market equilibrium. So what is the effect, therefore, the predicted effect of no-fault divorce would be a lower quasi-wage. Yes?
Didn't the employer have to compensate the one that fires? I mean, if you couldn't just divorce and then have your spouse be left completely unprotected. No? I mean,
well, it is certainly the case that certainly in Germany there are laws in place that protect workers in case of they get fired.
And marriage,
in the case of marriage, it varies. I think that a lot of these no-fault divorce laws really include very little protection for the people, male or female, who invest in their home-specific, spouse-specific skills. There's not much protection involved. So what we observe is that soon after no-fault divorce was introduced in California in 1970, and then in many other states later, and practically all the 50 states in the United States now have no-fault divorce, and they have had it for quite a while. What you've observed is that the institution of alimony practically disappeared. It used to be the case, I don't know what the translation is in German, I don't know if I know that in French there's different terms, it's kind of confusing. Alimony is a payment that is now very rare in the United States, but it's basically, in case of divorce, it's typically a monthly payment that the dependent spouse receives, regardless of whether there are children or not. Okay, so it used to be quite common that after divorce, typically women who had been housewives would receive alimony for the rest of their life. It was quite common. Soon after the introduction of no-fault divorce, it became very rare, and in many states in the United States it's not used at all. What replaced alimony is the concept that in long-term marriages, judges will often say that a woman who was a housewife or worked very few hours, that she would be receiving some payment that will allow her to learn, to go back to school, and within a given period of time she has to be independent and earn her own living. So it's more like a payment that allows her to go to school. It doesn't exactly have a name like alimony. Now, the demise of alimony can possibly be explained in terms of a lower quasi-wage. There was not, as long as divorce involved a negotiation by men and women, because they had to agree on it, then the partner who was heavily invested in the marriage and would lose a lot from the discontinuation of the contract would require, in a way, compensation and say, well, I won't give you divorce unless you give me alimony, you give me this, you give me that. Another thing we observe is that after the introduction of no-fault divorce, it became much less common that women kept the house. Used to be quite common, at least in California. There's an enormous amount of variation across states in the United States, but it used to be quite common that women at the time of divorce would keep the house, and the husband wouldn't have, would understand that's what he's part of the divorce settlement. In fact, I have a good friend in her 70s who has this beautiful home in Berkeley, California. It's very expensive there. And it was part of her divorce settlement, and her husband didn't keep anything. And yes, she did divorce around 1970, when it was still very common that women who had been housewives would receive the house at a settlement. Either alimony or the house was very, very standard. In recent decades, in California, it's very rare that women who have been housewives get either alimony or the whole house. So California is a community property state, and the common arrangement is half and half with community property. That's a typical divorce settlement. No alimony, just a brief time when people who don't have a profession have an opportunity to train for another profession, and half the house. So I think this is evidence of reduction in quasi-wage. I don't think there's been very good studies of that. There's been studies that were that have been covered in the press, but there's arguments about how well the research was done. Most economists don't study divorce settlements, so we don't have very good studies on that, but we do have a lot of economic research on the effect of no-fault divorce on divorce and on labor force participation of women. And I will just briefly mention this literature in case you're interested in pursuing it. First of all, Gary Becker, in his treatise on the family, he came up with the following insights. If we apply the Coase theorem, it wouldn't really matter whether who obtains the gains from marriage and the losses of divorce. It wouldn't matter in terms of the divorce rate. The production would remain the same. There's a change in the gains from marriage, who gets the gains from marriage, who gets the surplus, but his prediction was that the introduction of no-fault divorce would not affect the divorce rate. There's been a lot of studies trying to establish that empirically. In the treatise, he shows some statistics that just indicate a one-time increase in divorce rate, and then the divorce rate, according to Becker, went back down to its original level. However, others have found, and Elizabeth Peters also found that there was no long-range effect on the divorce rate. American Economic Review, 1986. More recent paper by Leora Friedberg showed that there was an effect on divorce, and so she disagrees with Becker and Peters. And there's been many others. It's just a recent article by Wolfers and somebody else also on this team. It's a very popular subject for research in economics of marriage and divorce. Let me, before I move on to the next topic, let me also mention that Peters and some other people, including Jeff Gray, has an excellent article on the effect of divorce laws, more specifically no-fault divorce, on participation of women in the labor force. The way I would explain the connection is, again, if divorce laws influence the quasi-wage and the quasi-wage is related to labor force participation, we would expect a connection between divorce and participation of women in the labor force before there is any divorce. And actually somebody brought that up, I think it was you, no? Who brought up in a previous lecture, didn't you say, what about divorce?
Yes,
yeah, so I think that it definitely belongs there, and that's another area in the law and economics of marriage that you could be studying. Now, what I want to do next is talk about a recent paper that's available on the website of your institute. And there are sets of tables available here that I will distribute. I think you should share them. There's not enough for everyone. This is research joint with Olivia Eckert-Jaffe from INED, Institut National d'Études Démographiques. And the question that preoccupies us here are birth out of couple. Out of couple is different from out of wedlock. It means that the child was born when the parents were not only that they were not married, but they were not living together. Another term for this is unpartnered birth. And we think this is an important subject for research because children are better off growing up with two parents. It might be very good for them to have two parents who are married, but at least it would be better that there is a father present when the mother gives birth, in most cases. By the way, there's another paper that hasn't been completed yet. This paper is almost complete. That I'm working on with a colleague at Columbia University, and I won't have much time to talk about it, so I'm just going to mention it. And that paper is about the choice between a child being born to married parents, cohabiting parents, a case where the father has recognized the child, and the parents, oh, it's snowing. There are some visits of the father. The child gets visits from the father. That's the third case. And the fourth case is the father is completely absent. So here we're only considering two cases, really, because we're putting together marriage and cohabitation. And we're comparing that with the father not living with the mother at birth. We're not distinguishing between situations where the father has recognized the child, is involved in the child's life, but doesn't live with the mother, versus situations where the child is not at all involved. And it does matter whether the father is involved or not. But for this paper, we're not paying attention to that because most data sets don't report information on whether the father visits the child if the child was born out of couple. But the data set that I'm analyzing in this other study with Professor Ronald Mincy from Columbia University, we are analyzing data from a data set called the Fragile Families. And that data set was collected in hospitals where lots of births are to women who give birth out of wedlock. and they were interviewed within 24 hours of giving birth, and they then found out if the father was present or not, and if the father came, they also interviewed the father. So it's a very special data set. Meanwhile, we're working on this study, which uses published data that was obtained in a very big project where many countries, European countries and some other Western countries, collected the same data, practically the same data. And so we have pooled the data from all these countries, and in some cases we've also analyzed individual countries. We are studying 12 countries and 17 legal regimes because there were some changes in some of our countries, and also in Canada we distinguish between various provinces of Canada with different legal regimes. To give you a sense of what goes on in terms of proportions of children born out of couple in the years we study, these are births between 1963 and 1992. Our data set includes West Germany, so if you were born in West Germany, most likely you were born sometimes between 63 and 92, so you might be included in the data set. Turns out that there's quite a bit of cross-country variation. Highest in percentage of unpartnered birth, and if anybody has a clue explaining that to me, I would appreciate it, is Austria, your neighbor. And Austria has 20% of birth out of couple. Okay, close to that is Canada. Actually, you have table 2 in your handout, has the percentages of out of couple first births. These are all first birth. And so the part of Canada that follows common law also has very high rates, 19%. The lowest ones are for Belgium, Flanders. We only have Flanders. And Italy and Spain are the lowest rates of out of partner birth. But as you can see, there's between 3% for Flanders and 20% for Austria. That's quite a variation here. The major prediction from our theory is that the more the law protects low-earning mothers who might benefit financially from being married, the more the law protects them in case of dissolution of the union, the higher the financial advantages for women to give birth in couple, and the lower the odds of an unpartnered birth. So that we take a very rational approach here, that women respond to incentives when they choose how to have their child. We're going to be considering 4 systems of rule 4 types of rules for division of joint property, RDJP: low community, medium community, high community, and no divorce. I'll explain that in a moment. We're assuming rationality, of course. And we're not ignoring men, because the men enter by influencing demand and supply, and therefore the quasi-wages that women can choose from. Okay, the decision rule in the model is as follows. There is something we call R squared. That's a latent variable that we do not observe. And it's equal to the difference between the benefits that a woman can expect giving birth out of couple minus Y, which are the benefits she can expect giving birth in couple. The decision rule is that if that latent variable is larger than 0, then she has the child out of couple. Now, what's included in the Y? That's basically a version of the quasi-wage. It's going to be a function of the quasi-wage that is obtained while the marriage goes on, which we call B. if it's translated in hourly terms, because this here we're not talking in hourly terms. It's not, we don't have that part of the model, but it can be easily translated that way. So you have a component of the benefits that is obtained during marriage and a component of the benefits that's obtained in case of divorce, and that's the D. And the equation that links them is this equation which is a function of the probability of divorce. So that's the expected quasi-wage, basically, but multiplying it by the actual earnings based on how much they will be working in this. So this is not an hourly concept here. We're going to be explaining whether a woman has a child out of couple as a function of the legal regime, and also as a function of other variables, individual characteristics, because we have a micro data set, and other characteristics of the society, including the sex ratio. So we're going to get back to the sex ratio. Getting back to the formula, where does it go in? Well, this D, the possible benefits in case of divorce, is going to depend on the rule that the country uses in case of dissolution, the rule they use to divide the marital property. That's going to affect the marital benefits. If you know that when people get divorced and a woman doesn't really have much of a career and she was mostly a housewife, if you know that she tends to get generous settlements, that she might be getting a big chunk of the marital property at divorce, then that you think, okay, well, there's more of an advantage to getting married. That's the idea. Sex ratio, we're back to the same idea, and we're also going to use this data set to test whether women who were born at a time of rapid growth in birth, and therefore the sex ratio is low, whether in this case the low quasi-wage, back to the equation, how the sex ratio enter in here, it would affect both B and D. It would basically affect this Y. Women who are born at a time of low sex ratios can expect less from their husbands if they get married, or for the man they live with if they cohabit, and therefore they might be more likely to conclude, who needs a man? I might as well have my child. I'll get pregnant and I'll just have my child alone. There's less to gain from being married if you know the quasi-wage is going to be low. And what is this sex ratio depending on? It depends, as we saw in an earlier lecture last week, it depends on how fast the population grows. So if there was a big baby boom at the end of the war, for example, like in the United States, then you have generations born right after the war with very low sex ratios. And they, according to this theory, they would be more likely to have a child out of couple. The women of this generation would be more likely to have a child out of couple. The countries with the most dramatic low sex ratios for women born right after World War II are Norway, where there was a 28% increase in number of births right after the war, New Zealand, 30% increase, Belgium, USA, Finland, and France. These are the countries in our data set that had very dramatic drops in sex ratio for women born between 46 and 50. However, Germany didn't have that because I think Germany, Italy, and Spain had very pro-natalist policies during the war, so there were actually quite a lot of babies born during the war. So you don't see a dramatic increase after the war in the number of births. And Sweden had its baby boom earlier in the 1940s, since they were neutral during the war. Okay, what are we expecting in this paper? We expect the following effects of rules for division of property. We're going to be looking at low degree of community property and high degree of community property, and in between is medium degree. What is meant by that? I think that the next slide might explain it. Okay, just look at table 2, it's better. Okay, table 2, rule for division of marital property, the second column. The countries with common law, like the USA and part of Canada, offer low community, because it means if the judge follows common law, there is no automatic rule that half, let's say half of the assets go to the partner who wasn't employed, for example. Typically in common law countries, when judges rule in case of divorce, they give less than half to the partner who did not accumulate the assets under her name or his name. So that these are not considered generous from the point of view of the rule of division of marital property. So we consider those low. We also consider Austria as having a low system. So basically the bottom line is our explanation for Austria. I'm sure it doesn't explain it all, but might very well contribute. Part of the reason why in Austria there's such a high rate of birth out of couple is that marital laws do not offer very generous settlement to women who specialize in household production in Austria. Most of the countries in our sample have community property over acquired assets, and that's what we label as medium community property. And that's also the case of Germany. Then we have Norway and Sweden, who have what we call high community property, because in case of divorce, the other spouse is entitled not just to the assets, half of the assets that were acquired during the marriage, but also to all the assets that were acquired prior to marriage. So if you marry somebody who was already rich at the time of marriage, in case of divorce, you would be getting half of all his or her assets in Norway and Sweden. Now, even in cases of cohabitation, these laws have an impact on how people get treated in case of separation. Very often and increasingly in Europe, cohabitation for legal purposes is considered like marriage. So that's why we apply these categories to analyze our choice between birth in couple and birth out of couple. We expect that in those countries that offer the highest degree of community property, there would be the lowest percentage of birth out of couple. And in those countries that offer the lowest degree of community property, namely the common law countries and Austria, there will be the highest proportion of out-of-couple birth, with the medium countries in the middle. We expect that the cohort of 46 to 50 will have higher levels of out-of-couple birth. And then we include other variables like teenagers are less rational, they're more likely to have out-of-couple birth. If women come from non-intact families, they're more likely to have non-couple birth. And then education and labor force participation also going to have effects that are predictable. So what do we find? Before I get to the findings, we also have interaction terms. The theory about the effect of the laws is less likely to apply to teenagers who are not very rational. They're less likely to make these calculations, so we don't expect to find much of an effect for teenagers. There's also, we have a religiosity variable for some of our countries, and we interact religiosity with the rule of division of property. But I don't know if I have extra time, or if you have questions afterwards, I'll get back to it. Right now I'm going to skip that because it's kind of long. We used definitions of the various legal regimes. The source for our definition of legal regime is in some volume by somebody named Vogel, if anybody's interested. The reference is in the paper. The data from this study come from the Family Fertility Survey, and they are retrospective data for women ages 15 to 59. What we have is 12 countries, unfortunately, not more than that, but we have 17 legal regimes, because there were changes in Italy, Spain, New Zealand, and the province of Ontario, Canada. Furthermore, we divide Canada into Quebec, which had community property all along, which we categorize as medium level of community property, and there's the common law provinces. Roughly, wherever you have Anglo-Saxon influence, you have common law, and whenever you have continental influence, either French or Spanish influence, let's say in various states of the United States or Latin America, in the case of Quebec and Louisiana, it's the French influence, you have community property. So that's roughly where it comes from. Okay, now I want to start with Table 6, the results in Table 6, where we are doing single country analysis for the change in legal regime. So we have 4 changes to study. In your handout, Table 6, the last one, effect of the previous rule. So what happened in both New Zealand and the province of Ontario, Canada, is that at some point they changed their rule. Namely, they went from common law to community property. And as you can see, under the previous rule, it's in bold, under the previous rule, there were more births out of couple than after the change in the law. So this is controlling for a trend, and overall the trend has been towards more children out of couple in both New Zealand and Ontario. This is controlling for the age of the mother at birth. There's a teenager effect. There's also a square term of age, because it turns out that when women are older, they're also more likely to have a child out of couple. To some degree, it has to do with the fact that maybe they give up on marriage. They figure, you know, that hasn't worked for me, so I'm just going to have a child alone. So you find that too. And in the case of New Zealand, we also find that there's an interaction between younger than 20, namely teenager, and low community property. So this really reinforces our insight that as these two places changed their law and introduced laws that are more protective of women who have low earnings and are likely to gain from community property. As community property was introduced, you see a reduction, significant reduction in out-of-couple birth. The next 2 columns are the case of Spain and Italy. In Spain and Italy, what happens is that they introduced divorce. Divorce was illegal. And in Italy, divorce was legalized in 1970. And I believe in Spain, yes, in Spain, the law changed in 1981. And what you find for Italy and Spain is that under no divorce, when there was no, under the previous regime, there were fewer children out of couple. So here we you know, it's not as clearly an application or a proof of this classification, because we're not exactly sure why a case of no divorce at all involves a higher quasi-wage. Do you have questions that I can address about the table? Seem to be talking about the table.
What's the variable again? Is it birth in couples or out of couples?
Oh, yes. Oh, that's a very good point. It doesn't say in the title of the table. So these are out of couple birth. Okay, it's a probability of an out of couple birth. So the previous finding that had positive signs meant that under the previous rule, under common law, there were more out of couple birth in Ontario and New Zealand. And now for Spain and Italy, under the previous rule, when there was no divorce allowed at all, so there were no laws for community property and so forth, because there were no divorces at all, there were fewer out of couple birth. So in Italy and Spain, after they introduced divorce, there was an increase in out of couple birth. Obviously not a very large increase, because they still, after many years later, they still have very low. Well, for this whole period between 1945 and 70, these are children born between 1945 and 70, and for this whole period, no, the women are born, I'm sorry, between 1945 and 70. The children are born between 62 and 92. And you can see that there is very low percentage of unpartnered birth in Italy and Spain. Okay, any other questions about Table 6? We're now going to move on to the other results. And we're going to go to Table 4. There's two tables here, 4 and 5. The difference between the two tables is that it's only in terms of when we observe the partnership. In the case of Table 4, we observe it 3 months prior to birth. So we're asking the question, was this woman in couple 3 months before giving birth? Whereas in Table 5, we look at the woman at birth. So the results are very similar, and I'm just going to focus on Table 4. And here we have some regressions for the whole sample of 31,000 and some women from 12 countries who lived in 17 legal regimes. And what we find is that living under a low community property regime significantly increases the likelihood of an out-of-couple birth. This result is very robust. We obtain it for all the specifications reported on this table, on the other table. We tried many other specifications, and this result is very robust. The second result, that the countries with high community, which basically is Norway and Sweden, in most of our regressions, we also find that they have a lower percentage of unpartnered birth. This goes against what we often think about Sweden, because if we just look at out-of-wedlock birth, it's certainly very high percentage of out-of-wedlock birth in Sweden. Most children are not born to parents who are married. However, Sweden has actually a low percentage of out-of-couple birth, because most children are born to parents who live together around the time of birth. For example, if you look at the average for the whole period, Sweden had 8% of unpartnered first birth. So about half of what you find in the United States. It's not very low, but it's definitely not so high, and counter to what most people think about Sweden. And once you control in regressions 5 and 6, you control for a lot more characteristics of the parents, like whether there is an intact family or not, how religious they are, the educational level. That information was not available for all the countries, so we can only incorporate it into regressions that are for either 8 countries or 7 countries, and that corresponds to 12 legal regimes or 9 legal regimes. And when we do these regressions, we find a strong effect of high community property. Sex ratio effect. Very strong, and throughout all the tables, just like predicted, women were born between 1946 and 1952, in this case, which is for many of the countries a period of low sex ratio, are more likely to give birth out of couple. The time trend is positive, of course, as we would expect. Although it's more so for some countries than others, and you could also see from the individual regressions that the time trend varies from one country to another. Finally, we find age effects like predicted, and religiosity is interesting. If a woman describes herself as observant, as religious, she's less likely to have a child out of couple. However, if she's religious and she lives in a low community country like the United States, we categorize the entire United States as a low community country, we find that the effect of religiosity is the opposite of the effect for the other type of countries. Number of siblings, if she has more between 1 and 3 siblings, she's less likely to have a child out of couple. What about education? Of course, it tends to be a low education thing, so the more education, the less it's likely to happen like that. Occupational status. Students are more likely to have children out of couple, so we find that women who are in school are more likely to have a child out of couple, out of labor and not in school. Negative effect, but it's not significant. Okay, the most significant signs were the ones that are in bold, and if it's 2 star, it's more significant than if it's 1 star. So these are the results of this study. Question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you assume that women behave rationally, shouldn't they anticipate, given the legal regime in their country, on how much to invest in education, for instance? I mean, yeah. I mean, you take this exogenous here, but...
Well, that's a fascinating idea. One could do another project, and I recommend it, to study whether these legal regimes have any impact on educational choices. I wonder if this could be part of the explanation of why women in the United States have, more likely to go to college, and you have it would be a good reason to obtain more education. If you cannot count as much on the law to protect you in case you get divorced. So it would possibly affect education decisions as well. It's a good point. Back to my earlier paper, I must tell you, last week I was mentioning that article that I published in 1981 with sociologist David Hare, that has the first presentation of the quasi-wage thing and how baby boomers would be in a less advantageous position because of this low sex ratio. And one of the implications was also education, that women would go more to school if they have low sex ratios. Now, the co-author of that study, I mentioned his name, David Hare, he just died. I mean, I was talking about him on Monday, I think it was, or Tuesday, and he died, I think, on Wednesday. So, sorry. I mean, you didn't know him, but I'm sorry to report that he died. And so that's an excellent idea to look at, study the effects on education. I haven't done that at all, and I don't know anybody who's done it. Are there any other questions? Yeah, you know what? Maybe I'll just leave it for questions now, if you have enough questions, because it's the last opportunity I have to talk to you, and so maybe you have questions not just on the materials I presented today, but maybe on other materials, and so we'll see how we go with 20 minutes for questions. Yes?
Actually, I have two questions. The first is, with this whole joint property thing, you were sort of looking from the perspective of the woman. That is, well, if I don't get much after the divorce, then I can just have the child by myself. But if you look at it from the perspective of the man, then it might be, if he knows that he doesn't have to give the woman that much after the divorce, he might be more likely to stay together with her. Do you get what I'm saying?
Right. It's very possible that it would have a different effect on the length of the relationships. It's certainly true that the same law, that whenever to the extent that it's advantageous to men, it's disadvantageous to women, and vice versa. However, men do not have the option of having a child alone out of couple. So that's why we are, we're using it this way. And it's very possible that it would also have behavioral and measurable impacts on the behavior of men, and possibly some behavior of the couple.
Because I find it hard to believe that 20% of women just say, well, I can have the child by myself. I don't really want a partner. So, my second question is, I think it's very likely that the welfare system has an influence, because, for example, in the United States, single mothers are like the largest recipient group. And so it might be worthwhile for the woman to say, oh, I don't have a partner. And so she only claims that she doesn't have a partner. Right. And so maybe that could have a really big...
Well, certainly the welfare system has a lot to do with it. And Olivia and I, are considering doing another paper that would look more into the various differences between the countries as far as their welfare benefits are concerned. But that's a really big project. However, at first sight, it doesn't seem like it would really work that well to explain many of these cross-country variations, because a lot of European countries also have very generous welfare systems. For example, the Scandinavian countries are extremely generous, whether women are married or not. So it still doesn't explain why in our sample 15% of all women in the United States choose to have a child out of couple, and in Sweden only 8%. So France has very generous benefits for women who are alone. It's a big debate right now in England, because a lot of people want to change the welfare laws that tend to be more generous for the women who are who have never been married or are not married, than to do, so that I guess it's definitely a very relevant variable, yes. But I don't think it will explain that much in our case. And, since many of you might be familiar with Austria and Germany, I mean, if anybody has a clue of why is it so much higher in Austria than in Germany, anybody has an alternative explanation? I don't think that our explanation accounts for all of this variation. I mean, it's just a partial explanation. Another possible interpretation of what we're saying is that there may be some underlying attitudinal cultural differences between the countries that simultaneously affect the laws and the behavior. It could be that there's something underlying these various laws. Why is it, if you look at a deeper level, why is it that the Anglo-Saxon countries have used common law in this case? Is it just a historical accident that they were very interested in business and they wanted to have, the common law system has great advantages from a business standpoint. And then they also apply to marriage and family. Is it just a really exogenous variable that it's common law or not? Or is there something more underlying about the approach to the family? I don't know. There are some differences here between the countries. I think we're up to an interesting story, but it may not just be about the law. Any other questions? Yes.
I was wondering how far can differences in abortion laws and the availability of
Which laws?
Abortion
laws.
And contraception methods, and how far can they explain the time trend? Because I think in the 70s, around that time, there have been many changes in that area.
Right, yes. That's also a very interesting direction to go. Initially, when we started this study, some of the colleagues of Olivia at INED who had studied abortion laws, pointed out to that, and she spent quite a bit of time incorporating changes in abortion law into our study, and ultimately it's one of the things we tried and we just relinquished from this perspective. It didn't really explain much. We did try that, and we get a lot more explanatory power from our model, and once you do it with the variables, we include the timing of changes in abortion law that doesn't have an impact. At the same time, there have been some interesting studies recently about changes in abortion laws and their impact on maybe not on this variable, but on other variables. I don't have the references offhand, but there are some. That's a topic of study that definitely belongs in the law and economics of marriage and the family, and it's an interesting subject. Yes.
Do you think that there can be an impact of the fertility rate in the countries on these percentages? Because I think, for example, if there is a country where the fertility rate is very low, then it might be possible that, for example, the birth out of marriage will be higher, because the woman will still have to have children, although the man doesn't want to pay for it, or you understand?
Right. I think maybe at a theoretical level, what we did here is that we assume this is only for mothers. All the women, the sample is a sample of women who gave birth. And another question that is very relevant is, what about the decision to have a child at all? And in a way that there's selectivity into the sample. And if we would have another study, which we don't have, that would have all these variables for, in a comparable way for a lot of countries, but it included not just women who gave birth, but also women who chose not to have a child or who don't have a child for any other reason, would be even more interesting. More could be done via econometric techniques to try to obtain something about the motivations and individual differences if we can have the selectivity factor as well. And of course, another, the whole topic of why it is that fertility rates are so low in Germany and many other countries is in itself a very challenging application of economics of marriage and the family. And it's a topic that isn't studied that much, but there's people working on it. But I don't think we have very good explanations for it. And one thing that strikes me is that the economic incentives that various countries have tried to use work only to some degree. One of the countries that I've been visiting recently, and I've been reading about them a lot, is Scandinavia. It's really, there's fascinating stuff going on in especially Sweden and Denmark, because they have been experiencing much less of a drop in fertility than many continental European countries. And in part, it's because of their very long leaves of, it doesn't seem so much the benefits they offer in monetary terms if you give birth, but the fact that you get generous leaves of parental leaves if you give birth. That seems to be, they were surprised. They didn't expect it to induce fertility, but that wasn't their goal. But they ended up inducing fertility by giving these long parental leaves, like 1 year or year and a half or something like that, depending on the country. So please feel free to ask questions, not just about today's lecture, but about any topic in economics and of marriage or the family. Anything you read that you'd like to know more about? There's not too many people who are local who specialize in this, so this might be your last chance to ask questions on this area for a while. Yes?
Just a study that should be interesting for you concerning whether it's an institutional framework or more like traditions.
More like what?
And if it's an institutional framework or more like some kind of tradition or peer group behavior, because one found out that in France, the fertility rate is considered relatively high in Europe, and women coming from Spain and Portugal moving to France, they have a higher birth rate on average than they would have if they stay in the country. And on the other hand, people coming from Arab countries have a significantly lower birth rate when they go to France than as they had before. So the question is really the institutional framework influencing this, or if it's just that you look at what are other people doing?
Well, you're teaching me something. I never saw those studies. That's very interesting. Well, if it's the case, then it would seem that there is a convergence to the French fertility rate. So that would indicate that the set of circumstances that France offers in terms of labor market opportunities, educational opportunities, daycare centers, whatever policies they have, seems to affect the immigrants from the various countries in similar ways, and similar to the people born in France, if there is this convergence to the French pattern that you're describing. So that seems to be the case. And the French pride themselves at having developed institutions that encourage women to combine a career with having children. Again, there could very well be some cultural variables. I think that ultimately it would be also very interesting to do empirical studies of consumption patterns in light of this material. For example, restaurants. What kind of restaurants people go to, the quality of the food that's home produced. It's really amazing when you think about how integrated Europe is from many points of view. But if you go to, if anybody would go through to a systematic study of the quality of food in restaurants in the various European countries, you would come up with a tremendous variation.
We volunteer to undertake such a study.
And where does it come from? My personal experience is that, in Italy and France, it's much harder to come across a very lousy restaurant. I'm not saying all restaurants are good, but really lousy food like I've experienced in some of my recent travels. It wasn't in Germany. I've been traveling a lot. So some of the lousy food I got in one of the restaurants I went to, I said to myself, I would never get this kind of food in Italy. And where does it come from? Where do the standards, and you see Italian restaurants all over Europe. People appreciate Italian cuisine. Why? Why did the Italians develop more talent for cooking? Could it be related to the institution of the family and to the? One could, given that there's substitution between the products that you buy in the market and the products that you get at home, there would clearly be. This might very well reflect something about the tastes of the people in terms of their homemade food. If you're used to getting lousy food from your mother or you bake lousy food, then you go to a lousy restaurant, it doesn't seem lousy to you. You think, oh, this is pretty good food. If you're used to, in your home, meals are gourmet every night, then either you or somebody else is a Feinschmecker, like they say in German. You would be having different consumer demands, and that will, supply will follow demand. So I think that is also an area for study of economics of marriage and the family. It's just one example, and so many of the products that we buy and the services that we buy are substitutes for what can be produced at home. So we can learn more about the products that can be bought by understanding better what the alternatives are in terms of home produced goods. It's another whole area for study. I have an article that I didn't mention. That's called The Consumer Theory of Marriage. It's actually pretty recent. It's 2003. It's quite complicated. I would be very happy if anybody wanted to read that article and see something that they want to pursue. I'd be happy to help them with that, because it's one of my favorite articles, and it has no impact because nobody wants to put in the time and effort to figure out what I try to say in that article. but the original title for it was "Who Does the Laundry" or something like that, and I think I may have taken it away. But it was one of the questions that's addressed in that article is about laundry. That has implications for restaurants and all kinds of consumer decisions. Well, are there any other questions? If not, I really thank you for coming. And if you want to email me, everybody has my email address, so should I just write it down? Let me write it down. It's mail.sdsu.edu. And I wish you good luck and goodbye.